Hello, everyone. Welcome to Blacktop Files. Tonight, we bring you 8 deeply unsettling accounts from the mountains of West Virginia, where the hollows run deep and the trees remember everything. These ancient Appalachian ridges have witnessed generations of isolated communities, abandoned coal operations, and tragedies that never made it beyond county lines. The testimonies you're about to hear come from people who ventured into these mountains for work, for family, or simply because the road took them there, and what they encountered in those shadowed valleys changed them forever. Some found things that shouldn't exist. Others were found by things they wish they'd never seen. These are their stories, shared with us on the condition that we tell them exactly as they happened. So turn down your lights, and whatever you do, if you ever find yourself on a mountain road in West Virginia and the locals tell you not to go somewhere after dark, listen to them.
This happened in October of 2017, when I was 32 years old. My name is David, and I'm from Columbus, Ohio. I work as a structural engineer, and I was contracted by a small mining company to assess the stability of some old coal operation sites scattered throughout the mountains of southern West Virginia. The company wanted to know if any of the abandoned infrastructure could be salvaged, or if it all needed to be demolished. It was supposed to be a straightforward 2-week job, driving from site to site, taking measurements, filing reports. I flew into Charleston and rented a truck, then started making my way south into McDowell County. The deeper I drove into the mountains, the more the landscape seemed to close in around me. The roads got narrower, the towns got smaller, and the trees pressed in on both sides like they were trying to reclaim the asphalt. I'd grown up in the Midwest where you could see for miles in any direction, so these mountains made me feel hemmed in from the start. The first few sites were routine: rusted conveyor systems, collapsed tipples, buildings with caved-in roofs. I'd document everything, take my photos, make my notes, and move on to the next location. The locals I encountered were polite but distant. They'd give me directions if I asked, but they never offered more information than absolutely necessary. There was a wariness in their eyes, like they were measuring whether I was the type to listen or the type to push my luck. On my 4th day, I was scheduled to assess a site called the Blackwell mine, located up a hollow called Schrader's Fork. The mine had been closed since 1973, and according to my paperwork, it was one of the larger operations the company wanted evaluated. My GPS stopped working about 3 miles up the hollow, so I had to rely on the hand-drawn map the company had provided. The road turned to gravel, then to dirt, then to something that was barely a road at all. Just 2 tire ruts with weeds growing between them. I passed a few trailers and old houses, but most of them looked abandoned. The ones that weren't had that lived-in but barely quality, with cars on blocks in the yards and tarps over the roofs. I saw one old man sitting on a porch, and when I slowed down to wave, he just stared at me with this completely blank expression until I drove past. Didn't wave back, didn't nod, just watched me like I was something that had wandered into the wrong place. The Blackwell mine was at the very end of the hollow, where the mountains pressed in so close that the afternoon sun barely penetrated the canopy. The main building was a long, low structure made of cinder blocks, its windows broken out and its metal roof partly collapsed. Behind it, I could see the mouth of the mine itself, a dark opening in the hillside secured with a heavy steel gate that was chained and padlocked. Beside the gate, someone had spray-painted "Stay Out" in faded orange letters. I parked my truck and got out, grabbing my camera and clipboard. The silence was immediate and total. No birds, no insects, no wind. Just the kind of heavy, pressing quiet that makes you aware of your own breathing. The air smelled like rust and damp earth, and something else I couldn't quite identify. Something vaguely chemical and unpleasant. I started with the main building, photographing the exterior damage and noting the structural issues. The roof would need to come down before it collapsed on someone. Most of the interior was gutted, just concrete floors and exposed beams, everything covered in leaves and bird droppings. But in what looked like it had been the office area, I found something odd. Someone had been there recently. There were fresh footprints in the dust, and in the corner, I found a circle of stones with the remains of a fire in the center. Around the circle, someone had placed objects, rusted tools, pieces of mirror, what looked like animal bones tied together with wire. It looked like some kind of ritual setup, which made me uncomfortable, but not particularly scared. I'd seen enough abandoned buildings to know that kids like to come to places like this to drink and mess around. The occult stuff was probably just teenagers trying to freak each other out. Still, something about it felt deliberate in a way that didn't quite fit the teenager theory. The stones were placed too carefully. The objects were arranged with too much intention. I took photos for my report and moved on to check the mine entrance. As I approached the gate, that chemical smell got stronger. It reminded me of sulfur, but not quite. Something more organic and rotten underneath it. The chain on the gate was old but still secure, and I had no intention of going inside even if it hadn't been. Mines like this could be full of toxic gases, unstable tunnels, and vertical shafts that dropped hundreds of feet. My job was just to assess whether the entrance structure was sound enough to leave standing, or if it needed to be sealed. I was photographing the gate when I heard it, a sound from inside the mine, a low scraping noise like something heavy being dragged across stone. I stopped and listened. The sound came again, definitely from deep inside the tunnel, echoing out through the darkness. Then it stopped, and I heard something else. Footsteps. Not the scraping anymore, but distinct footsteps, getting closer to the entrance. I backed away from the gate. The footsteps kept coming, steady and unhurried, getting louder. Then they stopped, and I heard breathing. Heavy, wheezing breaths, the sound of someone or something standing just beyond the gate in the darkness, just out of sight. I couldn't see anything. The mine entrance was pitch black beyond the first few feet, but I could hear it breathing, and I could feel something watching me from that darkness. I didn't wait to see if anything would come out. I turned and walked quickly back to my truck, trying not to run, but moving as fast as I could without looking, panicked. The breathing sound followed me, or at least I thought it did. When I reached my truck, I looked back at the mine entrance. The gate was still chained shut, and I couldn't see anything in the darkness beyond it. But I had the overwhelming sense that something was standing just inside, watching me leave. I got in the truck and started the engine, and that's when I noticed someone standing at the edge of the tree line about 50 yards away. A woman, I thought, though it was hard to tell. She was wearing what looked like a long, dark dress or robe, and her hair was long and black. She was absolutely motionless, just standing there staring at my truck. I couldn't make out her face from that distance, but I felt her eyes on me. I put the truck in reverse and started backing down the access road, keeping my eyes on my mirrors. When I glanced back toward where the woman had been standing, she was gone, just vanished. The trees were thick enough that she could have stepped back into them, but the speed with which she disappeared didn't feel natural. The drive back down the hollow felt longer than the drive up. The afternoon light was fading fast, and the shadows under the trees were getting deeper. I passed the same houses and trailers I'd seen on the way up, but this time I noticed things I hadn't before. Several of the occupied houses had symbols painted on the doors or hung in the windows. Crosses, hex signs, other things I didn't recognize. On one porch, I saw 3 old women sitting in a row, all of them watching my truck as I passed. None of them moved or acknowledged me. They just watched with these flat, expressionless faces. When I finally made it back to the main road, I felt like I could breathe again. I drove straight to my motel in a town called Welch and called my supervisor to report what I'd found. I kept it professional, sticking to the structural issues and leaving out the breathing sounds and the woman in the trees. But I did mention the evidence of recent activity at the site and suggested that local law enforcement might want to check it out before any demolition work began. My supervisor told me not to worry about it, that these old sites always had squatters and kids poking around, and that it wasn't my problem as long as I got my assessment done. He asked if I'd finished documenting the site. I lied and said yes. I had no intention of going back to Schrader's Fork. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those footsteps in the mine, getting closer to the gate, about that breathing sound, about the woman who'd been watching me from the trees. Around 2 a.m, I was lying in bed in my motel room when I heard something outside my window. A scraping sound, low and rhythmic, like something heavy being dragged across pavement. My room was on the 2nd floor. There shouldn't have been anything outside my window except the parking lot 20 feet below. But the scraping sound continued, and then I heard breathing. The same heavy, wheezing breaths I'd heard at the mine entrance, right outside my window. I didn't get up to look. I just lay there in the dark, listening, until the sounds finally stopped about 10 minutes later. In the morning, I checked out of the motel and looked at the ground below my window. There was nothing there. No marks, no disturbance in the gravel. But I knew what I'd heard. I spent the next week finishing my assessments of the other sites on my list, but I never went back to Schrader's Fork. I filed a report saying the Blackwell mine was too hazardous to assess without proper safety equipment, and recommended that the company hire a mining specialist if they wanted a detailed evaluation. They accepted my recommendation and paid my invoice. 3 months later, I heard through a colleague that the mining company had sold the Schrader's Fork property to a salvage operation. The salvage crew went up to start dismantling the surface structures, but they left after 2 days and refused to go back. The company tried to hire a different crew, but word had gotten around, and nobody wanted the job. As far as I know, the Blackwell mine is still sitting there at the end of that hollow, exactly as I left it. I still work as a structural engineer, and I still take contracts that require site visits to remote locations. But I don't take jobs in West Virginia anymore. Every time someone asks me why, I tell them I prefer to work closer to home. The real reason is that I can't forget those sounds. The footsteps in the mine, the breathing outside my window, and more than anything, I can't forget that woman standing at the edge of the trees, watching me with a stillness that wasn't human. Sometimes late at night when I'm alone, I still hear that scraping sound, and I know that whatever was in that mine is still there, waiting for someone else to come looking.
Our next account comes from a woman who discovered that some family properties in the West Virginia mountains carry obligations that go far deeper than taxes and maintenance.
My name is Ashley, and I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I'm 41 now, but this happened when I was 38, about 3 years ago. I'm a high school teacher, and I'd always thought I had a pretty good handle on my family history. My mother's side came from West Virginia, from a little place called Cotter's Ridge in Braxton County. My grandmother had grown up there, but she'd moved away in the 1950s and never really talked about it. She died when I was 19, and after that, the West Virginia connection was just something that existed in the background of family stories, not something that felt real or relevant to my life. Then in the spring of 2021, I got a letter from a law firm in Sutton, West Virginia. It informed me that my grandmother's sister, Aunt Margaret, had died at the age of 94, and that I'd been named in her will. I hadn't even known Aunt Margaret existed. My mother had mentioned having an aunt down in West Virginia once or twice, but she'd said they weren't close and hadn't been in contact for decades. According to the letter, Aunt Margaret had left me her property, a house, and 40 acres on Cotter's Ridge. My mother was strange when I told her about it. She got quiet and told me I should just sign whatever papers I needed to sign to sell the place and be done with it. When I asked her why, she just said that Cotter's Ridge wasn't a good place and that there were reasons our family had left and never gone back. She wouldn't explain further, which only made me more curious. I decided to drive down and at least see the property before I made any decisions. The lawyer I'd been corresponding with, a man named Mr. Hassler, agreed to meet me there and hand over the keys. He sounded relieved on the phone, like he was glad to be getting this obligation off his plate. The drive from Pittsburgh took about 5 hours. The last 20 miles were through increasingly remote mountain roads, the kind where you pass through tiny communities that are barely more than a cluster of houses and a church. Cotter's Ridge wasn't even a town, just a name for a particular stretch of mountain ridgeline where a handful of families had built homes over the years. Mr. Hassler met me at a pull-off where a narrow gravel road branched off from the main highway. He was a thin man in his 60s, wearing a suit that looked too heavy for the warm May weather. He seemed nervous, checking his watch repeatedly. "We'll take my truck," he said. "The road up to the property isn't maintained. Your car won't make it." We drove up the gravel road in silence for about 10 minutes. The road climbed steeply, switching back on itself several times as it wound up the ridge. The forest on both sides was dense with oak and hickory, and through the trees I could occasionally glimpse other houses, though they were far apart, and most of them looked abandoned. Aunt Margaret's house sat in a clearing near the top of the ridge. It was a small white clapboard structure with a sagging front porch and a rusted tin roof. Behind it was a weathered barn that looked like it might collapse in the next strong wind. The yard was overgrown with weeds and wildflowers, but someone had kept a garden plot turned over, the dark earth broken into neat rows. "She lived alone?" I asked. Mr. Hassler nodded. "For the last 40 years. Before that, she lived here with her mother, your great-grandmother. The property has been in your family since the 1870s. He handed me a large key ring with 3 keys on it. "House, barn, and this one," he pointed to the 3rd key, "is for the root cellar. It's around back. Your aunt was very specific in her will that you should check the cellar first thing." He paused. "She left you a letter. It's on the kitchen table." Something in his tone made me ask, "Did you read it?" "No," he said quickly. "It was sealed. But Miss Margaret gave me specific verbal instructions to pass along. She said you need to read the letter before you do anything else. And she said that if you decide not to stay, you need to find someone else from the family to take over. The property can't be sold to outsiders. It has to stay in the family." "Why?" I asked. Mr. Hassler looked uncomfortable. "She didn't explain, and I didn't ask. Miss Margaret she had her ways. Most of the old families up here do. I'd suggest you read the letter, Miss Rebecca. I need to get back to town before dark." He drove away before I could ask anything else, leaving me standing in the overgrown yard. The afternoon was warm and humid, and the cicadas were singing in the trees. But there was something oppressive about the silence underneath that sound. The house felt like it was watching me. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house smelled like old wood and dried herbs and something musty. The furniture was ancient, probably dating back to the 1950s or earlier. Everything was neat and clean, though. Like Aunt Margaret had been keeping the place up until the very end. The kitchen was small, with an old gas stove and a deep ceramic sink. On the table, exactly as Mr. Hassler had said, was an envelope with my name written on it in shaky handwriting. I sat down and opened it. The letter was 3 pages long, written in the same unsteady hand. "Dear Rebecca," it began, "if you're reading this, I'm dead, and you're the one who drew the short straw. I'm sorry for that. I tried to find another way, but the old compact doesn't give us much choice. By now you're wondering what I'm talking about. I'll be plain. This land has been in our family for 5 generations, and it's our responsibility to keep what's under it contained. Your great-great-grandfather Silas Cotter, found something in these mountains in 1872. A shaft that went down into the earth, deeper than any mine shaft, deeper than anything natural. He found things down there, old things, and he made a deal with them. In exchange for keeping the shaft sealed and making regular offerings, our family would prosper, and the things below would stay below. I stopped reading and looked around the kitchen, half expecting to find that this was some kind of joke. But the letter continued. The root cellar isn't just a cellar. It's the entrance to the shaft. There's a door at the back of it that's sealed with iron and marked with signs. That door must never be opened. Once a month, on the new moon, you must go down to the cellar and leave an offering at the door. It doesn't have to be much. Cornmeal, salt, honey, tobacco. Something real. Something grown or made. You'll know it's been accepted because the bowl will be empty in the morning. If you don't make the offerings, if you let the compact lapse, the things below will come up. They'll come for you first, because you're the one who broke the promise. Then they'll go looking for anyone else with Cotter blood. Our family has kept this responsibility for 150 years. Now it's yours. I'm sorry. I carried it as long as I could. The letter was signed with Aunt Margaret's name and a date from 2 weeks before her death. I sat there for a long time, staring at the pages. My first thought was that Aunt Margaret had been senile, that this was the rambling of a woman who'd lived alone too long and started believing her own ghost stories. But something about the tone of the letter didn't feel delusional. It felt tired and matter-of-fact, like someone explaining how to maintain a furnace or clean a well. I should have left. I should have gotten in my car and driven back to Pittsburgh and called Mr. Hassler to figure out how to disclaim the inheritance. But I didn't. I wanted to see the root cellar. I wanted to prove to myself that this was just an old woman's paranoia. The cellar entrance was exactly where Mr. Hassler had said, around the back of the house. It was a set of heavy wooden doors set at an angle into the ground, the kind of cellar entrance that used to be common in old farmhouses. The doors were held shut with a rusted padlock. I used the third key to open it. The doors were heavier than they looked, and they groaned on their hinges as I pulled them open. Stone steps led down into darkness. I used my phone's flashlight to see. The cellar was surprisingly large, maybe 20 feet square, with stone walls and a dirt floor. Shelves along the walls held dozens of mason jars filled with preserved vegetables, fruits, and things I didn't recognize, all covered in dust. In the center of the cellar was a wooden table, and on the table was a ceramic bowl filled with what looked like dried cornmeal. At the back of the cellar was another door. This one was made of heavy planks bound with iron straps, and it was covered in symbols that had been carved deep into the wood and painted over with something dark and flaking. I recognized some of them as crosses and hex signs, but others were shapes and patterns I'd never seen before. A newer padlock secured the door, and chains had been wrapped around the handle and bolted into the stone wall. I stood there looking at that door for a long time. I couldn't hear anything from the other side, but I felt something. A pressure, like the air itself was heavier near the door. And a smell, very faint, like earth and stone, and something else. Something that reminded me of meat left out too long. I left the cellar and closed the doors behind me. Back in the house, I read Aunt Margaret's letter again, looking for anything that would explain what was supposedly down there, but she'd been frustratingly vague. Old things, things below. She'd been intentionally cryptic, or maybe she genuinely didn't know what was down there. only that something was. I spent that night in the house. I told myself I was just being practical, that it was too late to drive back to Pittsburgh, and I wanted to go through Aunt Margaret's belongings in the morning. But the truth was, I wanted to see if anything would happen. If the letter was true, the next new moon was in 2 weeks. Whatever was supposed to happen wouldn't happen yet. Nothing did happen that night. I slept poorly in Aunt Margaret's old bed, waking up several times to silence and darkness. In the morning, I went back down to the cellar. The bowl on the table was still full of cornmeal. Nothing had changed. I spent 3 days at the house, going through Aunt Margaret's things. I found diaries going back decades, but she never mentioned the shaft or the things below. She wrote about the weather, about her garden, about the families who lived nearby. The closest she came to acknowledging anything unusual was a repeated phrase that appeared every month in her entries. Kept the promise today. That was all. No details, no explanations. On the 4th day, I drove back to Pittsburgh. I told myself I'd decide what to do about the property later, but I kept thinking about that door at the back of the cellar, about the symbols carved into it, about the promise my family had supposedly been keeping for 150 years. The new moon came 2 weeks later. I was at home in Pittsburgh trying to focus on grading papers when I started feeling wrong. It started as a headache, then became a sensation of pressure behind my eyes. By evening, I was dizzy and nauseous. I went to bed early, and that's when I started hearing the sounds. Scratching, like something was trying to get through the walls. And under that, a low humming sound that wasn't quite mechanical and wasn't quite alive. I called in sick the next day. The sounds continued, always just barely audible, always just at the edge of my perception. When I tried to focus on them, they'd stop. But the moment I turned my attention to something else, they'd start again. I felt like I was being watched, even in my own apartment. Shadows seemed darker and longer than they should be. Twice I saw something out of the corner of my eye, a tall, thin shape standing in doorways. But when I looked directly, nothing was there. On the 3rd night, I woke up to find my bedroom door open. I always lock it before bed, but it was standing wide open, and in the hallway outside, I could see that same tall shape. It was darker than the darkness around it, like a human silhouette cut out of black paper. It didn't move, but I could feel it looking at me. We stayed like that for what felt like minutes. Me in my bed, it in my hallway. Then it stepped backward and disappeared. I drove to Cotter's Ridge the next morning. It took 5 hours, and I spent the entire drive trying to convince myself that I was having some kind of breakdown, that stress and suggestion had made me imagine everything. But I knew better. I went straight to the root cellar. The bowl on the table was completely empty. The dried cornmeal that had been in it 3 weeks ago was gone, not scattered, not spilled, just gone. I don't know how. The cellar doors had been locked, but the bowl was empty. I went back to my car and drove to a store in Sutton. I bought cornmeal, salt, honey, and tobacco. Back at the house, I mixed them together in the bowl and carried it down to the cellar. I set it on the table in front of that carved and chained door. Then I went back upstairs and waited. That night, the sounds stopped. The feeling of being watched disappeared. I slept better than I had in days. In the morning, I went back to the cellar. The bowl was empty again. I've kept the promise every month since then. I drive down from Pittsburgh on the new moon, leave my offering in the cellar, and drive back. I've never seen or heard what takes the offerings. I don't want to. But I know it's real. Because the one time I missed a month, when I was sick with the flu and couldn't make the trip, the scratching sounds came back. And the shadows in my apartment grew so dark and thick that I could barely see through them. I made it down to Cotter's Ridge 2 days late, left a double offering, and the sounds stopped again. I still live in Pittsburgh. I still teach high school. But once a month, I drive 5 hours to a falling down house on a West Virginia mountain ridge and leave food in a bowl for something that lives in a shaft beneath the earth. I've looked for other family members who might take over the responsibility, but there aren't any. My mother died last year, and I'm an only child. My cousins are distant and scattered. The property is mine, and the promise is mine. Sometimes I think about what Aunt Margaret wrote in her letter, about what my great-great-grandfather found down there in 1872. About the deal he made, I think about how one man's choice bound 5 generations of his descendants to this place, to this obligation. I wonder what would happen if I broke the compact completely, if I sold the house to strangers and walked away. But I already know the answer. I know because I felt what started to come for me when I missed that offering. And I know that whatever is down there, sealed behind that iron-bound door, it's patient. It's been waiting for 150 years, and it can wait longer, as long as it gets what it was promised.
This testimony comes from a man who learned that some roads in the West Virginia mountains exist on maps that were never meant to be followed.
My name's Carl, and I'm from Frederick, Maryland. I'm 35 now, and I work in IT. But this happened back in 2019 when I was 33. I've always been into backpacking and wilderness camping, and that fall, I decided to hike a section of the Allegheny Trail that runs through the mountains of eastern West Virginia. It's not as famous as the Appalachian Trail, but it's supposed to be beautiful, especially in October when the leaves are turning. I'd planned a 4-day loop that would take me through the Monongahela National Forest, starting and ending at a trailhead near a place called Burgoo. I'd done plenty of solo trips before, and I'm careful about preparation. I had good gear, a satellite GPS device, enough food for 6 days, and I'd filed my itinerary with the ranger station. The first 2 days went exactly as planned. The weather was perfect, cool, and clear, and the fall colors were spectacular. I saw maybe 3 other hikers total, which was fine by me. I liked the solitude. On the second night, I camped near a stream about 8 miles from the nearest forest road, and I fell asleep to the sound of water running over rocks. On the morning of the 3rd day, I started noticing that things felt slightly off. The trail markers seemed farther apart than they should be, and twice I had to backtrack because I thought I'd missed a turn. My GPS was working fine, showing my position and the trail I was supposed to be following, but something about the landscape didn't quite match what I was seeing on the map. The distances felt wrong. By early afternoon, I came to a fork in the trail that wasn't on my map. Both paths looked equally maintained. Both had trail markers, but my map clearly showed that the trail should continue straight with no junction. I checked my GPS coordinates 3 times. According to the device, I was exactly where I should be, on a straight section of trail with no forks for another 2 miles. I stood there for probably 10 minutes trying to figure it out. The left fork seemed to head northwest, which was roughly the direction I needed to go. The right fork went northeast, uphill toward a ridgeline. Finally, I decided to trust my GPS and go straight, even though both visible paths clearly turned away from straight ahead. I pushed through some brush between the 2 paths and found what looked like it might have been a trail at some point, overgrown but still passable. That was my first mistake. The overgrown path went on for about a mile, getting less and less defined until it wasn't really a path at all, just a direction through the woods. I should have turned back, but I kept thinking that I'd intersect with the main trail again soon. The GPS still showed me moving in the right direction, tracking along the line where the trail should be. Around 4 in the afternoon, I came out of the trees onto a road. A real road, gravel but well maintained, wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass. It ran along the side of a mountain, curving out of sight in both directions. I checked my map again. There was no road anywhere near where I was supposed to be. The nearest forest road was over 3 miles away. But there it was. I could see tire tracks in the gravel, recent ones. I sat down and tried to figure out what had gone wrong. Either my GPS was malfunctioning and I'd gotten way off course, or the map was wrong. Neither option made sense. GPS devices can lose signal, but mine showed full satellite coverage. And Forest Service maps don't just miss entire roads. I decided to follow the road downhill, figuring it had to come out somewhere, and then I could orient myself. That was my second mistake. I walked for about an hour. The road stayed in good condition, winding down the mountain through dense forest. I didn't see any houses or side roads or any indication of where the road led. Just trees on both sides and gravel under my feet. The light was starting to fade, and I was thinking I'd need to find a place to camp soon when I saw the sign. It was an old road sign, the kind that's made of wood with routed letters, set back from the road on a post. It said, "Welcome to Stillwater," and below that, population 43. There was no date, no county name, nothing else. Just the town name and population. I didn't remember seeing Stillwater on any of my maps, but that didn't necessarily mean anything. West Virginia is full of tiny communities that barely register. I kept walking, expecting to see houses or a gas station or something. The road curved around a bend, and there it was. Stillwater was maybe a dozen buildings strung along both sides of the road. A few houses, a church, something that might have been a store with boarded up windows, and a larger building with a metal roof that could have been a community center or school. There were no cars, no lights, no people. The place looked abandoned, but not old abandoned. The buildings were intact, paint wasn't peeling, roofs weren't caved in. It looked like everyone had just left recently. I walked into what I thought was the center of town, my boots crunching on the gravel. It was completely silent. No birds, no wind, nothing. The quiet was so deep it felt physical, like pressure against my eardrums. I called out, "Hello?" and my voice sounded flat and wrong, like the air was swallowing the sound before it could travel. The church was the most intact building, a small white structure with a simple steeple. The door was unlocked, so I went inside. The interior was plain, just rows of wooden pews and a pulpit at the front. But on the wall behind the pulpit, someone had painted a mural. It showed a mountain with a valley, and in the valley were buildings that I recognized as Stillwater itself. Above the mountain, the sky was dark, and in that darkness were shapes. Abstract shapes, I thought at first, but the longer I looked at them, the more they seemed intentional. They looked like hands, dozens of enormous hands reaching down from the sky toward the town. Underneath the mural, someone had written in neat script, "The Hollow calls and we answer, 1962, 1973. I left the church and checked the other buildings. The store was completely empty, shelves bare, nothing left behind. The houses were the same, furniture still in place, but no personal belongings, no clothes, no dishes, nothing that would indicate who'd lived there. It was like the place had been carefully cleaned out by people who'd had time to take everything they valued. Behind the church, I found a cemetery. Most of the headstones were old, dating from the 1800s and early 1900s. But there was a section of newer graves, all from the same year, 1973. 43 graves. I counted them. The same number as the population on the sign. The names on the graves were varied, different families, but every single death date was the same, October 14th, 1973. All 43 people had died on the same day. The sun was setting, and I needed to make a decision. I could camp in one of the buildings in Stillwater, or I could keep moving and try to find somewhere else. Everything in me was screaming to keep moving. The silence of the place was wrong. The empty buildings were wrong. The cemetery with its 43 graves from the same day was very, very wrong. I started walking out of town, back the way I'd come. The road led uphill now, and my legs were tired from a full day of hiking, but I pushed myself to keep a steady pace. I wanted to get as far from Stillwater as possible before it got fully dark. The road climbed for about 20 minutes, then crested a ridge. On the other side, it started descending again, and I could see buildings ahead. My heart sank. It was Stillwater. The same church, the same boarded-up store, the same houses. I'd somehow looped back to the town. I stopped and tried to understand what had happened. I'd walked uphill the entire time. I hadn't turned around. There was no way I should be back at the same place. But there was the sign, "Welcome to Stillwater, population 43. I turned around and started walking uphill again, faster this time. I walked for 30 minutes, my headlamp now on because it was getting dark. The road crested the ridge. The town was below me again. The same town, Stillwater. I tried a third time, this time paying close attention to any place where the road might branch, or where I might be getting turned around without noticing. There was nothing. The road just went up and over the ridge, and Stillwater was always on the other side. It, HTTP, side, it, was fully dark now. I was exhausted, scared, and running out of options. I could try to leave the road and hike through the forest, but in the dark with rough terrain, that was a good way to get hurt. I could stay on the road and try walking in the other direction, or I could camp in Stillwater and wait for daylight. I chose to stay on the road and walk the other direction, away from the ridge. I walked for over an hour, following the road as it wound down the mountain. And then, ahead of me in the beam of my headlamp, I saw the sign. "Welcome to Stillwater, population 43. I'd come back to the town from the opposite direction. The road somehow looped back on itself no matter which way you walked. I was trapped. I sat down on the edge of the road and tried to think rationally. Roads don't loop back on themselves. Geography doesn't work that way. Either I was experiencing some kind of medical emergency, a stroke or hallucination or something impossible was happening. I checked my GPS. It showed me as being miles away from Stillwater, still on the Allegheny Trail, moving in a straight line. But I wasn't on the trail. I was on this road. I was in this town. I heard the singing around midnight. I'd been sitting in what I thought was the center of town, my back against the wall of the church, trying to stay awake and alert. The singing started faintly, like it was coming from far away, but it got louder. It was voices, maybe a dozen of them, singing in harmony. The song was hymn-like, but not any hymn I recognized. The words were in English, but I couldn't make them out clearly. The singing was coming from the direction of the cemetery. I stayed absolutely still, watching. The singing got louder, and then I saw them. Lights moving between the trees behind the church. Flashlights or lanterns, bobbing as people walked. The singing continued, getting closer. I should have stayed hidden. I should have kept quiet. But I was so desperate to see another person, to find someone who could explain what was happening, that I stood up and called out. The singing stopped instantly. The lights stopped moving. For a long moment, everything was silent. Then the lights started moving again, faster now, coming toward the church, coming toward me. I ran. I didn't even think about it, I just ran. I went back to the road and sprinted uphill toward the ridge. Behind me, I could hear voices now, calling out. They weren't calling words, just making sounds, whoops, and cries that echoed through the town. And I could hear footsteps, lots of them, running on the gravel. I ran harder than I've ever run in my life. My pack was bouncing on my back. My legs were screaming. My lungs were burning. I hit the crest of the ridge and kept going, running downhill now. I knew what was on the other side. I knew I'd see Stillwater again. But I didn't know what else to do. Except when I came over the ridge this time, Stillwater wasn't there. The road continued down the mountain, but there were no buildings, no sign, nothing. Just forest and gravel road. I kept running for another mile before I finally collapsed, gasping for air. I sat there for maybe 20 minutes, listening. I didn't hear any pursuit. The night was silent again, except for my own breathing. When I could finally stand, I started walking. The road went on for another hour before it intersected with a paved highway. There was a sign, Route 219. I knew that road. It was a major highway through the area. I flagged down the first car I saw, which happened to be a sheriff's deputy. He was skeptical of my story at first, thought I was drunk or high, but I showed him my GPS, showed him where I'd been. He drove me back to my car at the Barragoo trailhead and told me I'd gotten turned around in the woods, that it happens sometimes. The road I'd found was probably an old logging road, and the town was likely a former logging camp. People see weird things when they're tired and stressed, he said. I didn't argue with him, but I spent the next few weeks researching. I looked for Stillwater in every database I could find. Historical records, census data, topographic maps, everything. I found 3 places called Stillwater in West Virginia, but none of them were in the Monongahela National Forest, and none of them had a population of 43 or had been abandoned in 1973. I did find one thing, though. In the archives of a local newspaper from 1973, I found a brief article dated October 17th of that year. It mentioned that authorities were investigating the disappearance of residents from a small community in Randolph County. The community wasn't named, and there was no follow-up article, just that one brief mention of people who'd vanished. 43 people disappeared in October 1973, the same number as the graves in that cemetery, the same year as the date on the church mural. I don't hike in West Virginia anymore. I don't care how beautiful the trails are, because somewhere in those mountains, there's a road that doesn't exist on any map, and at the end of that road, there's a town where 43 people died or disappeared on the same day. And that town is still there, waiting. The road knows how to find people. It knows how to loop back on itself until you're trapped. And when night comes, the people of Stillwater, or whatever's left of them, come out to see who's arrived.
The next story comes from a fire lookout who spent one summer in the West Virginia mountains learning why some warning systems aren't designed to protect the people below.
This happened in the summer of 2016. My name's Jake. I'm from Asheville, North Carolina, and I was 26 at the time. I just finished my master's degree in forestry, and I wanted to spend a summer doing something completely different before starting a career job. I applied for a fire lookout position with the Forest Service, and I got assigned to a tower in the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia. A place called Briggs Knob. Fire lookout work is exactly what it sounds like. You live in a small cabin at the top of a tower, usually on the highest point in an area, and your job is to watch for smoke and report any fires you spot. It's isolated work. The tower at Briggs Knob was about 8 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by a hiking trail. Supplies were brought in once a week by Forest Service staff, and I had a radio for communication. Otherwise, I was alone. The tower itself was about 60 feet tall, a metal structure with a small enclosed cabin at the top. The cabin was maybe 12 feet square with windows on all sides, a small cot, a desk, a propane stove, and the radio equipment. Basic, but it had everything I needed. The view was incredible. From the top, I could see for miles in every direction, ridge after ridge of forested mountains. The first few weeks were peaceful. I'd wake up early, make coffee, and spend the day scanning the horizon with binoculars, noting any smoke or haze. I'd read, write in my journal, and at night I'd watch the stars. The isolation didn't bother me. I'd always been comfortable with my own company. The only weird thing was the notebook. When I'd arrived to take over the position, the previous lookout, a guy named Dennis who'd been doing the job for 3 summers, had left me a handwritten note. It was just a single line. Follow the log exactly, don't add anything extra. The log was a large ledger book where I was supposed to record anything unusual, weather conditions, smoke sightings, that kind of thing. Dennis's entries were brief and factual, times, locations, descriptions, nothing personal. I didn't think much of his note. I figured it was just his way of saying to keep things professional. But around my 3rd week, I started noticing something odd. Every entry Dennis had made was during daylight hours. He'd recorded sunrise and sunset times, noted weather conditions throughout the day, logged a few smoke sightings that turned out to be controlled burns. But there was nothing about the nights. Not a single entry between sunset and sunrise for the entire 3 summers he'd worked there. That seemed strange to me. Some of the most dramatic weather happens at night, storms and lightning. And if a fire started at night, it would be visible as a glow against the sky. I mentioned it over the radio during one of my check-ins with the ranger station, and the ranger I spoke to, a woman named Carol, got quiet for a moment. Then she said, Dennis had his system. If it worked for him, that's what matters. When I asked what she meant, she changed the subject. I started paying more attention at night. The tower had a propane lamp, and I'd keep it on low while I read or worked on my laptop. The forest at night was never completely quiet. I'd hear owls, coyotes sometimes, the wind in the trees, normal sounds. But around week 4, I started hearing something else. It started as a distant humming, not mechanical, more like a very low note being held continuously. It would start around 10 or 11 at night and last for maybe an hour. It seemed to come from the direction of a valley to the northwest, a particularly deep hollow that locals called Kettle Run. During the day, Kettle Run looked like any other valley, just thick forest and a stream. But at night, when I heard that humming, the valley looked darker than the surrounding forest. Like the darkness, there was deeper. I mentioned the sound to Carol during my next check-in. Again, she got quiet. Then she said, You're hearing Kettle Run. Don't worry about it. It's natural. What kind of natural? I asked. Geological, she said. Caves and wind. Stay in the tower at night, Jake. That's in the regulations for a reason. I hadn't planned on leaving the tower at night anyway. Climbing down 60 feet of metal stairs in the dark wasn't appealing. But her warning made me curious. I started watching Kettle Run more carefully during the day. I couldn't see much, just treetops in the shadow of the valley. But I noticed that I never saw any birds flying over it. Birds would circle over other parts of the forest, hawks and vultures riding thermals, but they avoided Kettle Run. The humming continued every night, and I got used to it. It became part of the background, like the wind. But then about 6 weeks into my summer, I saw the lights. It was just after midnight. I'd been reading and had glanced up to rest my eyes when I noticed a glow in the direction of Kettle Run. My first thought was fire, and I grabbed my binoculars, but it wasn't fire. The lights were moving, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, small points of light floating up from the valley like embers from a fire, but moving in patterns that were too organized, too deliberate. They rose in spirals, synchronized, pulsing brighter and dimmer. They'd rise a few hundred feet, then descend back into the valley, then rise again. It was beautiful and completely unnatural. No insects fly like that. No natural phenomenon I'd ever heard of. I watched for about 20 minutes, and then the lights descended back into the valley and didn't reappear. The humming continued for another half hour, then stopped. The forest went back to normal night sounds. In the morning, I called it in. Carol listened to my description, and I could hear the tension in her voice. You're not the first to see them, she said. Did you record it in the log? I said I was about to. She told me to wait. 20 minutes later, she was back on the radio with her supervisor, a man named Ed Thornton. Ed had been with the Forest Service for 30 years. He asked me to describe exactly what I'd seen, which direction, what time. Then he said, Jake, here's the situation. You're going to see those lights about once a week for the rest of the summer. Don't record them in the log. Don't tell anyone else about them. And absolutely do not go down to Kettle Run to investigate. I asked why. He said, because we have an agreement. The lookout tower stays. You do your job. You report fires. You don't ask questions about Kettle Run. In return, you stay safe. Dennis understood that. The person before him understood that. Now you understand it. I pushed back. I asked what the agreement was and who it was with. Ed's voice got hard. Jake, I'm telling you this for your own good. People who go to Kettle Run don't come back right. Sometimes they don't come back at all. We've had 3 different incidents over the years, hikers or curiosity seekers. 2 of them were found days later, miles away, with no memory of what happened. 1 was never found. The Forest Service has a responsibility to keep people safe, and part of that means knowing when to leave things alone. Kettle Run is one of those things. After that conversation, I tried to do what Ed said. I didn't record the lights. When I saw them, which was every week or so, I'd note the time in my personal journal, but not in the official log. I tried to treat it as just another part of the job. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. I spent hours during the day watching Kettle Run through binoculars. I never saw anything unusual in daylight, just forest. But the valley still had that quality of being darker, like the shadows there were thicker. In late July, about 8 weeks into my summer, I heard someone calling for help. It was mid-afternoon, and I was outside on the platform around the cabin checking the anemometer. The voice was faint, coming from the direction of Kettle Run. "Help, please, someone help." A woman's voice. I grabbed my radio and called it in. Carol said she'd send someone to investigate and told me to stay at the tower. But the voice kept calling, and it sounded desperate. I could hear the panic in it. I kept watching through binoculars, trying to see anyone on the trails, but I couldn't spot anyone. The voice called for about 10 minutes, then stopped. An hour later, Carol radioed back. The rangers had hiked the main trails in that area and found nothing. No signs of anyone in distress. She asked if I was sure about the direction. I was sure. Carol said they'd keep looking, but that sometimes sounds carry strangely in the mountains, that the woman could have been much farther away than I thought. That night I heard the voice again. Same woman, same desperate calls for help. But it was midnight, and the voice was coming from the direction of Kettle Run. I stood at the window with my spotlight shining it toward the valley, but the beam didn't reach far enough. The voice continued for about 5 minutes, then stopped. The humming started shortly after. I radioed Carol first thing in the morning. She sighed when I told her. "Jake, you're hearing the valley. It does that sometimes. It's not a real person." "It sounded real," I said. "I know, but it's not. Trust me, if we sent people down there every time the valley made sounds, we'd never get anything else done. Just try to ignore it." But I couldn't ignore it. Over the next 2 weeks, I heard the voice 3 more times, always at night, always calling for help. Sometimes it was the woman's voice, once it was a man's voice, once it sounded like a child. Each time I'd report it, and each time Carol would tell me it wasn't real. In my 10th week, I broke protocol. I left the tower at night. I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to see what was down in Kettle Run. I waited until just after the humming started, around 11 p.m., then I grabbed my spotlight and started down the tower stairs. The climb down was terrifying in the dark, but I made it. At the bottom, I turned on my spotlight and started hiking toward Kettle Run. The trail led downhill through thick forest. The humming got louder as I got closer to the valley, and I started to feel it in my chest, a physical vibration. The air smelled different too, not bad, but mineral and cold, like deep caves. I'd been hiking for maybe 20 minutes when I saw the first light. A small blue-white sphere about the size of a basketball floating between the trees about 30 yards ahead. I stopped. The sphere drifted slowly, pulsing. Then another appeared, and another. Within a minute, there were dozens of them moving through the forest in those same spiraling patterns I'd seen from the tower. They were beautiful up close, leaving faint trails of light. But they also felt wrong. The way they moved was too purposeful, and I realized that they were moving in a pattern around me, forming a circle. That's when I heard the voice, the woman's voice calling for help. But this time it was close, maybe 20 feet away. I shone my spotlight in that direction. There was no one there, just trees and the floating lights. The voice called again from a different direction, then the man's voice from behind me, then the child's voice from my left. All of them calling for help, overlapping, echoing. I ran. I turned back toward the tower and ran as hard as I could. The lights followed me. They stayed just at the edge of my spotlight's beam, keeping pace no matter how fast I ran. The voices kept calling, getting louder, more frantic. I fell twice, scraping my hands on rocks, but I got up and kept running. The humming was so loud now that it was all I could hear, drowning out everything else, even my own breathing. I don't remember getting back to the tower. One moment I was running through the forest with the lights chasing me, and the next I was climbing the stairs, my legs shaking, my lungs burning. I made it to the cabin, slammed the door, and collapsed on the floor. The humming was still there, vibrating through the metal of the tower. I looked out the windows. The lights were at the base of the tower, hundreds of them now circling the structure. They spiraled up, rising higher, and for a terrible moment I thought they were going to come up to the cabin. But they stopped about 20 feet below, hovering there, pulsing. They stayed like that for hours until just before dawn, when they finally descended and disappeared back toward Kettle Run. I radioed Carol as soon as the sun was up. I told her everything. There was a long silence. Then she said Ed wanted to talk to me. Ed's voice was angry. "You went to Kettle Run?" "Yes," I said, after I specifically told you not to. "I had to see. You don't have to see anything. You had a job, and part of that job was following instructions. Now you've complicated things." He paused. "Are you hurt?" "Just scraped up." "But Ed, what are those lights? What's down there?" "I don't know," he said, and I believed him. "Nobody knows. The valley's been like that as long as anyone can remember. The locals won't go near it. The old-timers say it's where the mountain breathes out what it doesn't want. What I do know is that the tower has stood on Briggs Knob for 60 years, and as long as the lookout stays in the tower at night, nothing bad happens. You broke that pattern. I need you to stay put. Do your job and don't leave the tower again until your contract is up. Can you do that?" I agreed. I had 3 more weeks on my contract. I stayed in the tower. The lights came back every week, but they didn't approach the tower again. They stayed down in Kettle Run doing their spiraling dance. The humming continued, and sometimes on the quietest nights I'd still hear the voices calling for help from the valley. I finished my summer and left. I never went back. I work for the Forest Service now, but I made sure to get assignments in other states. When people ask me about fire lookout work, I tell them it's peaceful, meditative, a great way to disconnect. I don't tell them about Kettle Run. I don't tell them about the lights or the voices or the agreement that keeps the tower standing. But sometimes I think about the 3 people Ed mentioned, the ones who went to Kettle Run and didn't come back, right? I think about the one who never came back at all. I think about how close I came to being number 4, and I wonder what's really down in that valley, what makes those lights, what calls out in voices that sound human but aren't. The forest has its secrets, and West Virginia's mountains have more than most. Some of them are better left alone.
Our next account comes from a truck driver who discovered that some deliveries in West Virginia require more than just dropping off cargo.
My name is Mark. I'm from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and I'm 52 years old. I've been driving trucks for 28 years, long haul mostly, and I've seen just about every part of the country. I've driven through blizzards in Montana, dust storms in Texas, and fog so thick in Washington state that I couldn't see 3 feet in front of my rig. None of that prepared me for what happened on a delivery run to West Virginia in the winter of 2018. The job seemed straightforward. I was contracted to deliver construction supplies, lumber, and roofing materials to a work site in Preston County. The delivery address was for a place called Marorrow Hollow, which my GPS couldn't find, so the company sent me written directions. The route took me off Route 50 onto progressively smaller roads, exactly the kind of delivery I'd done 100 times before. I loaded up in Cumberland, Maryland, and started the drive in the early afternoon. The weather was overcast but clear. temperature in the 30s. The roads were good until I turned off Route 50, and then it became the typical narrow, winding mountain roads you find all over Appalachia. The directions took me through a few small communities, more like clusters of houses than actual towns, and then onto a road that my truck barely fit on, branches scraping both sides of the trailer. The directions said Marorrow Hollow was 17 miles from the last turn, but the road was so rough and winding that it took me over an hour. I didn't see any other vehicles. I passed a few houses, but they all looked abandoned, or nearly so. Around mile 15, I started wondering if I'd taken a wrong turn, because I couldn't imagine any active construction site being this remote. Then I came around a bend and saw the gate. It was a new gate, heavy steel with a chain-link fence stretching into the woods on both sides. A sign on the gate said, Marorrow Hollow Development, authorized personnel only. There was an intercom box, so I pulled up and pressed the button. Nothing happened. I waited, pressed it again. Still, nothing. I tried calling the phone number the company had given me, but I had no cell signal. I sat there for about 10 minutes trying to figure out what to do. The gate was closed with a heavy chain and padlock, and there was no way my truck could get through. I was about to turn around and head back to find a phone when I noticed someone walking up the road on the other side of the gate. It was a man, maybe in his 60s, wearing canvas work clothes and a heavy coat. He didn't wave or acknowledge me, just walked up to the gate and stood there looking at my truck. I got out of my cab. Hey, I've got a delivery for Marorrow Hollow Development. Are you with the construction crew? The man looked at me for a long moment, then said, You got the lumber? Lumber, roofing materials, everything on the manifest. Can you open the gate? He shook his head slowly. Can't open it for vehicles. Company rules. You'll have to carry it in. I stared at him. Carry it? This is a full truckload. Couple 1,000 pounds of materials. I can't carry that. Then you can't deliver it, he said flatly. Gate stays closed. You want to get paid, you carry it in. He turned and started walking back up the road. I called after him. How far is the site? Without turning around, he said, 1/2 mile. I stood there trying to process this. In 28 years of driving, I'd never had a delivery requirement this ridiculous. But I needed the money, and I'd already driven all the way out here. I called out again. I'll start unloading. Can you at least send some guys to help? The man stopped and turned around. There aren't any guys, just me. And I don't carry, I supervise. Then he walked away and disappeared around a bend in the road. I spent the next 2 hours hauling materials from my truck to the other side of the gate. The gate had a small pedestrian door that I could open, and I used a hand truck to move as much as I could. It was exhausting work, and the light was starting to fade. I'd moved maybe a third of the load when I realized I was going to be there until, well, after dark. Around 5 p.m., as I was making another trip through the pedestrian gate, the old man came back. He watched me work for a minute, then said, "You're not going to finish before dark." "No kidding," I said, breathing hard. "You don't want to be here after dark," he said. I straightened up and looked at him. "Why not?" "The hollow changes after dark. You need to be on the other side of the gate." "Look," I said, "I don't care about ghost stories or whatever. I need to finish this delivery." The old man's expression didn't change. "Not a ghost story. The hollow has rules. During the day, we're allowed to be here as long as we follow procedures. After dark, we're not allowed. Doesn't matter if we're here or not. After dark, it's not our place." "Whose place is it?" I asked, humoring him. "The hollow's," he said. Then he walked away again. I kept working. The sun set around 6:30, and I turned on my truck's work lights so I could see. The temperature dropped fast once the sun was down, and my breath fogged in the air. The forest around me got very quiet. No animal sounds, no wind, just the sound of me moving materials and my own breathing. I was about halfway through the load when I heard the singing. It came from somewhere up the road, in the direction the old man had gone. Multiple voices singing in harmony, but the song was strange. The melody wandered, never quite resolving, and the words weren't in English. Or maybe they were, but distorted, stretched out so that I couldn't understand them. I stopped and listened. The singing continued for maybe a minute, then stopped abruptly. In the silence that followed, I heard footsteps, lots of them, coming down the road toward the gate. I couldn't see anyone because the work lights from my truck only illuminated the immediate area, but I could hear them clearly. Heavy boots on gravel, many people walking in step. The footsteps got closer, and I backed up toward the gate. I was on the wrong side, the Marorrow Hollow side, with all my unloaded materials. The footsteps came right up to the edge of the light, and then they stopped. I still couldn't see anyone, just darkness beyond the reach of the lights. But I could feel people there, standing just outside the light, watching me. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded small and uncertain. The footsteps started again, but this time they were circling, moving around the edges of the lighted area. I turned, trying to keep track of them, but they moved too fast. It sounded like a dozen people or more, walking around and around the gate area, staying just in the darkness. Then the singing started again, closer now, all around me. The same wandering melody, the same incomprehensible words. I bolted for the pedestrian gate, squeezing through and slamming it behind me. The singing stopped instantly. The footsteps stopped. Everything went quiet. I stood on the road side of the gate, my heart hammering. In the light from my truck, I could see the materials I'd unloaded, stacked neatly on the Marorrow Hollow side. I couldn't see anything else. The darkness beyond the light was complete. I don't know how long I stood there. Long enough for my heartbeat to slow down. Long enough to start questioning what I'd heard. Maybe it had been the wind in the trees. Maybe I was more tired than I thought. But I knew what I'd heard. Footsteps. Singing. Many people moving in the dark. A voice behind me nearly made me jump out of my skin. "Told you not to be here after dark." It was the old man. He'd approached silently on the roadside of the gate. In the darkness, I could barely make out his shape. "What the hell was that?" I demanded. "The hollow, coming back to itself," he said. "During the day, we can work here because of the arrangement. After dark, it's theirs. You're lucky you made it back through the gate." "Theirs? Whose?" The old man was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The development company didn't tell you the history of this place, did they? Marorrow Hollow was a town once. About 90 people lived here from the 1880s until 1934. Coal mining families mostly. In 34, the mine collapsed. Killed every man and boy who was working that day. 47 people. After that, the town started dying. People moved away. By 1940, there were only a dozen families left. By 1950, everyone was gone." He paused, and I heard him take a breath. "But the town didn't want to be empty. That's what the old stories say. The houses didn't want to be abandoned. The church didn't want to be silent. So the Hollow made a deal. The people who died, the ones whose bones were still under the mountain in that collapsed mine, they could come back. Not as they were, but as something else. They could have the Hollow after dark. During the day, it would be empty. The living could use it if they followed the rules. After dark, it belonged to the dead." I stared at him. "That's insane." He shrugged. "Maybe. But the development company knows. That's why they built the gate. That's why no vehicles are allowed past it. That's why all the construction happens during daylight hours and everyone leaves before sunset. The company got the land cheap because of its history. They're planning to build vacation cabins here, sell them to people from the city who don't know better. But the contractors know. The locals know. That's why I make sure the rules get followed. Why the hell would anyone buy land here? I asked. Company plans to tell buyers it's a gated community for privacy, which is true in a way. They just won't mention what the gate is really keeping in. He gestured toward the road. You should go. Take your truck and drive away. I'll make sure the company knows you delivered the materials. I didn't finish unloading, I said. What's on this side of the gate is enough. The rest... He looked toward the materials I'd stacked on the Marorrow Hollow side. The rest is a donation. The Hollow will take it. I wanted to argue, but more than that, I wanted to leave. I walked back to my truck, did a multi-point turn on the narrow road, and started driving out. In my side mirror, I could see the old man still standing by the gate, lit by my work lights. Behind him, in the darkness on the Marorrow Hollow side, I thought I saw movement, shapes, lots of them, moving toward the gate. But I didn't stop to look closer. It took me over an hour to get back to Route 50. By the time I hit the main highway, my hands had stopped shaking. I drove straight through to Harrisburg, didn't stop except for gas. When I got home, I called the trucking company and told them I'd delivered everything they'd paid me to deliver. They thanked me and wired my payment. A few months later, I heard from another driver that the Marorrow Hollow development project had been abandoned. The construction company had walked away, left all the materials and equipment on site. He'd been hired to recover some of the equipment, but when he'd gotten there, he found the gate open, and everything on the Marorrow Hollow side of the fence was gone. The lumber, the roofing materials, all of it. Just vanished. The construction trailer was empty, doors hanging open, but there were no signs of theft. Just empty ground where materials had been stacked. The company blamed vandals, filed an insurance claim, and wrote off the whole project. But the driver told me something else. He said when he was there, in the middle of the day with the sun high and bright, he could hear singing coming from somewhere up the hollow. Faint but clear. Multiple voices, harmony, a song that didn't quite make sense. He said he didn't stick around to finish his assessment, just took a few photos and left. I don't take deliveries to West Virginia anymore. If a job comes up, I pass it to someone else. When they ask why, I tell them I prefer to stay on the interstate, that the back roads are too rough on my truck. What I don't tell them is that I still sometimes wake up, hearing that singing, that wandering melody that never resolves. And I think about that old man standing by the gate and the shapes moving in the darkness behind him. And I wonder if the vacation cabins ever got built. I wonder if families are living there now, in Marorrow Hollow, with their gates and their rules about being inside before dark. And I wonder if they hear the singing at night, and if they know what it means when the voices rise from the hollow where 47 miners still lie buried under the mountain.
This next testimony comes from a woman who learned that some bed and breakfasts in the West Virginia mountains cater to guests who checked in long ago and never quite left.
My name is Kate, and I'm from Richmond, Virginia. I'm 37 years old and work as a freelance photographer. This happened in the fall of 2020 during October. I'd been commissioned to shoot a series of photos for a travel magazine focusing on historic inns and bed and breakfasts in the Mid-Atlantic region. One of the properties on my list was called the Kenszinger House, located outside a small town called Parsons in Tucker County, West Virginia. The Kenszinger House had a good reputation online. The reviews praised its Victorian architecture, its peaceful setting, and the attention to historical detail. It had been built in 1887 by a timber baron named Albert Kenszinger and had operated continuously as either a private residence or an inn for over 130 years. The current owners, a couple named the Morgans, had bought it in 2015 and restore it extensively. I made a reservation for 3 nights. The plan was to arrive on a Thursday, spend Friday and Saturday shooting, and check out Sunday morning. I'd have plenty of time to capture the house in different light conditions and get a variety of shots for the magazine. The drive from Richmond took about 6 hours. I arrived in the late afternoon, just as the October sun was turning everything gold. The Kenszinger House sat at the end of a long gravel driveway, surrounded by maples and oaks in full autumn color. The house itself was stunning, a 3-story Victorian painted in shades of cream and burgundy with a wraparound porch, turrets, and gingerbread trim. It looked like something from a postcard. Mrs. Morgan met me at the door. She was in her 50s, friendly and welcoming, and she gave me a tour of the public areas before showing me to my room. The house had been restored beautifully. All the woodwork was original, the furniture was period appropriate, and the Morgans had done a remarkable job of modernizing things like plumbing and electricity without destroying the historical character. My http://character.my room was on the 2nd floor at the end of a long hallway. It was a corner room with windows on 2 sides, decorated with Victorian furniture and wallpaper with tiny floral patterns. Mrs. Morgan explained that this had been a guest room, even in the original house, and that they'd kept it as close to the original layout as possible. "You're our only guest right now," Mrs. Morgan said. "We have 2 other couples arriving tomorrow, but tonight you'll have the place mostly to yourself. My husband and I live in the converted carriage house out back, so if you need anything after 9 p.m., just call the number we put by the phone." That surprised me. "You don't stay in the main house at night?" "We used to," she said, and something in her tone made me pay attention. "But we found it easier to give guests their privacy. The house has a history of creaky floors and old pipes, lots of character. We found that guests were more comfortable when they knew they had the place to themselves, that any sounds they heard were just the house settling." She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Makes for a better experience." After she left, I unpacked and started scouting shots. The light was perfect, and I spent until sunset photographing the exterior. As the sun went down and the shadows lengthened, the house took on a different quality. It was still beautiful, but there was something about the windows, the way they reflected the dying light, that made them look less like windows and more like eyes. I had dinner in town at a small diner and got back to the Kenszinger House around 8 p.m. The building was dark except for the porch light and the light in my room. I let myself in with the key Mrs. Morgan had given me, locked the door behind me, and went upstairs. The house felt different at night, bigger somehow, and the silence had a quality to it that made me hyper-aware of my own sounds. My footsteps on the stairs, the creak of the floorboards, the rustle of my clothes. I told myself I was just experiencing what guests in old houses always experience, that natural feeling of being alone in an unfamiliar place. I spent a couple hours going through the photos I'd taken, editing and organizing. Around 10:30, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my room. They were distinct, the sound of someone walking slowly past my door. I assumed it was Mr. or Mrs. Morgan, maybe checking on something. But I remembered Mrs. Morgan saying they stayed in the carriage house, and besides, she'd said I was the only guest. I got up and opened my door. The hallway was empty. The lights were on, those dim sconces that the Morgans had installed to look like old gas lamps, but there was no one there. I walked to the end of the hall and checked the stairs. Nobody. The house was silent again. I went back to my room, telling myself I'd heard the house settling, or maybe sounds from outside that seemed closer than they were. Old houses made noises. That was normal, but 20 minutes later, I heard them again. Footsteps, this time coming up the stairs. Slow, measured steps, like someone taking their time. They reached the second-floor landing and started down the hall toward my room. I watched the door, waiting for a knock. The footsteps stopped right outside. I could see the shadow of feet through the gap under the door. "Hello?" I called out. "No." HTTP out. No. Response. The shadow didn't move. I waited for maybe 30 seconds, then walked over and yanked the door open. The hallway was empty. No one was there. But I felt a rush of cold air from the hallway, cold enough to make me catch my breath. And the air had a smell to it, old perfume, and something medicinal, like camphor. I closed the door and locked it. My hands were shaking slightly. I'd stayed in plenty of old buildings. I'd heard plenty of unexplained sounds. But this felt different. This felt intentional. Like something had walked up to my door and stood there, waiting to see what I would do. I tried to go to sleep around midnight. I left one of the lights on, telling myself it was because I might need to get up in the night and didn't want to stumble around in the dark. The truth was that I didn't want to be in complete darkness. I woke up at 2:17 a.m. I know the exact time because I looked at my phone. I'd woken up because I heard voices. They were faint, coming from somewhere else in the house. A conversation, multiple people talking, the rhythm of back and forth dialogue, but I couldn't make out any words. Then I heard laughter, bright and clear. A woman's laughter, like she'd just heard something delightful. I got out of bed and cracked open my door. The voices were louder now, and they seemed to be coming from downstairs. I could hear music too, piano music, someone playing a waltz. The hallway was still empty, still dimly lit. I stood there listening, trying to decide if I was going to investigate or go back to bed and pretend I hadn't heard anything. The decision was made for me when I saw her, a woman in a long dress, Victorian-style dark blue with a high collar and long sleeves. She appeared at the far end of the hallway, near the stairs, just materialized like she'd been there all along, and I'd only just noticed. She was young, maybe in her 20s, with dark hair piled on top of her head. She was looking down the stairs, like she was listening to something, and then she laughed. The same bright, clear laugh I'd heard moments before. She started walking toward me. Her footsteps made no sound. She moved like she was gliding, her dress not quite moving the way fabric should move. She was looking down the stairs, not at me, smiling like she was enjoying a conversation I couldn't hear. She passed within 3 feet of where I stood frozen in my doorway, as HGT doorway, as she passed. The cold hit me again, that same bone-deep cold I'd felt earlier, and the smell, perfume and camphor. She continued down the hall, past my room, past the other rooms, and simply faded away near the wall at the end. She didn't disappear suddenly. She just became gradually more transparent until there was nothing but the empty hallway. I closed my door and locked it. Then I pushed a chair against it. I sat on my bed with all the lights on, my phone in my hand, trying to decide what to do. I could leave. I could pack my things, walk out to my car, and drive away. But it was the middle of the night, and something about leaving the room, walking through that hallway, going down those stairs where the piano music and voices were still audible, felt more frightening than staying where I was. I stayed awake until dawn. the voices and music continued until around 3:30, then stopped abruptly. After that, the house was silent. When daylight finally came through my windows, I felt like I could breathe again. Mrs. Morgan arrived at 7 a.m., letting herself in with a key. She knocked on my door, and I opened it to find her holding a tray with coffee and pastries. "Good morning," she said cheerfully. "I thought I'd bring you breakfast before we get started today. Did you sleep well?" I looked at her. "You know this house is haunted." Her smile faded. She glanced down the hallway, then back at me. "May I come in?" I let her in. She set the tray down and sat in the chair I'd pushed against the door during the night. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "What did you see?" I told her. The footsteps, the woman in the hallway, the voices and music. Mrs. Morgan listened without interrupting, her expression tired. When I finished, she said, "That was probably Eliza Kenszinger, Albert's youngest daughter. She died in 1892, 5 years after the house was built. Typhoid fever. She was 23. From what we can find in the historical records, she loved parties. The Kenzingers used to host social events, dances and dinners, and Eliza was apparently the life of every party." "She's still here," I said. Mrs. Morgan nodded. "She's still here. So are several others. We don't know all their names, but we think there are at least 4 or 5 permanent residents. Eliza is the most active. We see her most often, and guests report her regularly." "Why didn't you tell me when I checked in?" Mrs. Morgan looked uncomfortable. "Because most guests never notice anything. If we warn everyone, we create expectation and anxiety. People start interpreting every normal sound as paranormal. But the people who actually experience something, we try to be honest with them." She paused. "The house has a reputation in certain circles. Ghost hunting groups want to investigate it. Paranormal enthusiasts want to stay here. But we're not a haunted house attraction. We're a legitimate inn. We want to honor the history of the house, including its ghosts, without turning it into a circus." "Do you see them?" I asked. "Sometimes," she admitted. "More often we hear them. The music, the conversations, footsteps. In the first year we owned the house, my husband and I would stay in the main building at night. We'd try to interact with them, figure out who they were, but we realized they weren't interested in us. They're not trying to communicate. They're not asking for help or trying to deliver messages. They're just continuing, living the lives they had, the routines and social events and daily activities. The house is their home, and they never left." I thought about that. "Has anyone ever been hurt?" "No," Mrs. Morgan said firmly. "They ignore the living for the most part. Sometimes they seem curious, like when Eliza walked past you, but they don't interact. There's no malice, no danger, just presence." She stood up. "I understand if you want to check out early. We'll refund your money, no questions asked, but if you want to stay and complete your assignment, you're welcome to. Daylight hours are completely normal. The activity only happens at night." I thought about leaving. I seriously considered it, but I'm a photographer and I'm practical about these things. What I'd seen was unsettling, but Mrs. Morgan was right that Eliza hadn't tried to hurt me or even acknowledge me. She'd just been walking down a hallway in her own house, enjoying her own party. And from a professional standpoint, I had a job to complete. "I'll stay," I said, "but I'm leaving my lights on at night." Mrs. Morgan smiled. "That's fine. Many guests do." I spent that Friday shooting interior photos. The house was extraordinary in daylight. Every room had been restored with care, and the morning sun streaming through the old wavy glass windows created beautiful effects. The other guests arrived in the afternoon, 2 couples who were interested in Victorian architecture. Mrs. Morgan gave them the same tour she'd given me, and they settled into their rooms on the second floor. That night, I heard the party again. Voices, laughter, piano music. Around midnight, I cracked open my door and saw that I wasn't the only one. The couple in the room across from mine were standing in their doorway listening. The man saw me and whispered, "Do you hear that?" I nodded. The three of us stood there, listening to a party that was happening somewhere in the house, but nowhere we could see. After about 10 minutes, the man's wife said, "It sounds like they're having a wonderful time," and then she closed their door. Eliza walked past again around 1 a.m. This time, I was ready for it. I watched from my doorway as she materialized at the end of the hall, walked past me with that soundless glide, and faded away. She was smiling, lost in her own world. Behind me, I heard one of the other room doors open, and one of the other guests whispered, "Did you see that?" On Saturday night, the last night of my stay, I decided to try something. When I heard the music start around 11 p.m., I went downstairs. The parlor, where the Morgans kept an original 1890s piano, was at the front of the house. As I got closer, the music got louder. Someone was playing beautifully, a complicated waltz. The parlor door was open, and I could see the piano clearly from the hallway. No, HTTP. Hallway. No, one was sitting at the bench. The keys were moving by themselves, pressing down in patterns, the hammers striking the strings. But there was no visible person playing. I stood in the doorway and watched for maybe 5 minutes. The song concluded with a flourish, and then there was silence. The keys settled. For a moment, I thought I saw a shape sitting at the bench, the vague outline of a person, but then it was gone. I went back upstairs. I'd gotten what I needed for the magazine, beautiful photos of a beautifully restored Victorian inn. But I knew I wouldn't mention the ghosts in the article. Mrs. Morgan was right. They deserved to have their home honored, not turned into a tourist attraction. I checked out Sunday morning. As I was loading my car, Mr. Morgan came out from the carriage house. I hadn't met him before. He was a quiet man, older than his wife, with careful eyes. He watched me pack, then said, "You saw Eliza?" "I did," I said. He nodded. "She was my favorite from the beginning. The research we did showed she was kind, generous, loved by everyone who knew her. When I see her in the hallway, smiling like that, I think about how her life was cut short, 23 years old. She should have had decades more. Instead, she's here, still young, still happy, still going to parties that ended 130 years ago." He paused. "Sometimes I envy her. She never had to grow old or lose people she loved. She's frozen in the best moment of her life." I drove back to Richmond thinking about that, about Eliza, walking the hallways of her father's house, attending eternal parties, about the others who shared the house with her, whoever they were, about Mrs. Morgan's words. They're just continuing. The article I wrote for the magazine was published 2 months later. It focused on the architecture and restoration work. I included my best photos of the inn, including one shot of the second-floor hallway that turned out exceptionally well. The light was perfect, and the Victorian details were crisp and clear. But when I looked at the photo on my computer, really looked at it, I could see a faint shape at the far end of the hall, just barely visible, like a trick of light and shadow. But if you knew what to look for, you could see her. Eliza, in her blue dress, gliding down the hallway toward another room, another party. I didn't mention it to the magazine. I kept that detail to myself. Some things are better left as secrets, shared only by people who have been to the Kenszinger House and walked its hallways at night, listening to music from a century ago, and watching young women in long dresses hurry to parties that will never end.
Our next story comes from a mining engineer who discovered that some tunnels in the West Virginia mountains were dug deeper than any official record shows.
This happened last year, 2024. My name's Tom, and I'm 44 years old. I live in Charleston, West Virginia, and I work as a mining engineer specializing in remediation, basically cleaning up and securing old mining operations. West Virginia is full of abandoned coal mines, some dating back to the 1800s, and many of them pose environmental or safety hazards. My job is to assess them and develop plans to seal them, remove hazardous materials, or stabilize them if they're at risk of collapse. In August of last year, I was contracted by the state to assess a cluster of abandoned mines in Boone County, near a place called Hewitt Creek. The mines had been part of a larger operation that closed in the 1960s, and recent erosion had exposed several old entrance tunnels. The state was worried about people exploring them and getting hurt, or about the tunnels collapsing and causing subsidence damage to nearby properties. I'd worked on dozens of similar projects, so this seemed routine. I drove out to the site with a young assistant engineer named Kyle, who was fresh out of college and eager to learn. We parked at a pull-off near the creek and hiked about a mile up a ridge to where the mine entrances were located. There were 3 main entrances that we could see, all of them partially collapsed but still accessible. The timber supports were rotted, and there was significant water damage. I set up our equipment, gas detectors to check for methane or carbon monoxide, and structural assessment tools to measure stability. Then Kyle and I entered the first tunnel. The mine was typical of small operations from that era. Low ceilings, narrow passages, hand-dug in places and blasted in others. We moved carefully, testing the air and documenting the condition of the supports. About 100 feet in, the tunnel branched. The left branch was collapsed completely, just a wall of fallen rock. The right branch continued deeper into the mountain. We followed the right branch for another 200 feet until we came to a larger chamber, probably where they'd extracted a particularly rich coal seam. The chamber was maybe 30 feet across, with several support pillars left in place. On the far side, I saw another tunnel entrance, smaller than the main passages, barely 4 feet high. "That's odd," Kyle said. "Looks like they dug an exploratory shaft." I knelt down and shone my light into the small tunnel. It went straight for as far as I could see, maybe 50 yards, then seemed to open into another space. The walls were rougher here, less finished, like they'd been dug hastily. And there was something else. Marks on the walls. Not the tool marks you'd expect from mining, but scratches. Deep, parallel gouges, hundreds of them running along both walls. Kyle noticed them too. What made those? "I don't know," I said. I'd never seen anything like it in any mine I'd worked in. Could be geological, some kind of stress fracture pattern, but it looks intentional. "Should we check it out?" Kyle asked. "According to our safety protocols, we shouldn't have. Unexplored side tunnels were a potential hazard, and we were only there to assess the main passages. But I was curious. The scratches bothered me. They looked like claw marks, which was impossible, but I wanted a closer look. "Stay here," I told Kyle. "Keep radio contact. If I'm not back in 15 minutes or if you lose my signal, get out and call for backup." I had to crouch to fit through the small tunnel. My helmet scraped the ceiling, dislodging dirt and pebbles. The scratches on the walls were even more pronounced up close. They cut deep into the rock in sets of 3 or 4 parallel lines, as if something with multiple claws had scraped along the walls as it moved through the tunnel. The tunnel opened into another chamber after about 60 feet. This one was different from the mining chambers. It was circular, maybe 20 feet in diameter with a domed ceiling. The walls were covered in those scratch marks, thousands of them, overlapping and crisscrossing, and in the center of the chamber there was a shaft, a vertical shaft, maybe 6 feet across, dropping straight down into darkness. I approached carefully and shone my light down. The shaft went deep, deeper than my light could reach. I dropped a stone into it and listened. It took almost 4 seconds to hear the impact, which meant the shaft was at least 200 feet deep, far below the level of the coal seams that had been mined here. Around the edge of the shaft, someone had placed objects, rusted tools, pieces of metal, what looked like old chains, and bones. Animal bones, I thought at first, but as I looked closer I realized some of them were too large for any animal I could think of. Femurs that looked human, but were nearly 4 feet long. Skulls that were almost the right shape but had the wrong number of teeth and eye sockets that were too big. I backed away from the shaft. My radio crackled. Kyle's voice. "Tom, you okay? It's been 10 minutes. "I'm fine," I said, heading back. I took photos of the chamber, the shaft, and the bones with my phone, then crawled back through the small tunnel to where Kyle was waiting. He looked relieved to see me. "What was back there?" he asked. "Something that's not in any mining report I've ever seen," I said. "Come on, we're documenting this and getting out." We spent another hour mapping the accessible parts of the mine, then hiked back to our vehicle. I called my supervisor that evening and described what I'd found. He was skeptical at first, thought I might have stumbled onto an old exploratory borehole that had been forgotten in the records, but when I sent him the photos, he got quiet. "Those aren't mining marks," he said finally, "and I don't know what those bones are. I'm sending someone from the State Geological Survey to take a look." The geologist arrived 3 days later, a woman named Dr. Patricia Chen who specialized in abandoned mines and karst formations. Kyle and I took her to the site, and the three of us went into the mine. When she saw the small tunnel with the scratches, she stopped and examined the walls carefully. "These weren't made by tools," she said, "and they're not natural. Something created these marks through repeated friction, like an animal rubbing against the walls, but the depth and pattern..." She trailed off. "Let's see the chamber." We crawled through to the circular room. Dr. Chen spent a long time examining the shaft and the objects around it. She took samples of the bones, photographed everything, and measured the shaft's dimensions. Finally, she sat back and looked at me. "This isn't part of the coal mining operation," she said. "This chamber predates it, by a lot. These scratch marks on the walls, they've been here for decades at minimum, possibly much longer. And this shaft," she shone her light down into it again. "This goes much deeper than any coal operation would ever need to go. This is something else." "What do you think it is?" Kyle asked. Dr. Chen hesitated. "Off the record, I think this is an old legend made real. There are stories in these mountains about deep places, shafts that go down into the earth farther than any mine, places where the mountains have their own passages. The old-timers call them whistlers because of the sound the wind makes when it moves through them. The stories say they're old, older than the mountains themselves, and that you can hear things in them if you listen. Things that don't sound like wind. That's just folklore," I said. "Maybe," Dr. Chen said, "but I've been studying caves and mines in Appalachia for 20 years, and I've heard those stories from dozens of sources, different counties, different communities, but the same basic story. Deep shafts that were here before humans, that go down into places we're not supposed to go. And the things around the shafts, the offerings and the bones, those fit the pattern too. People used to make offerings to the whistlers, leave things to appease whatever was down there." "You think something's down there?" Kyle asked. He sounded like he was trying to keep his tone light, but I could hear the tension underneath. "I think this shaft connects to something," Dr. Chen said carefully. "A cave system maybe, or some kind of natural formation. Whether there's anything living down there," she shrugged, "we'd need to send down equipment to map it. But honestly, I'm not sure that's a good idea." "Why not?" I asked. She looked at me. "Because every story about the whistlers ends the same way. The people who go down into them don't come back. Or if they do, they're changed, silent or mad or both. There's a reason these places get covered up and forgotten. Some knowledge isn't worth having. We left the mine." Dr. Chen filed her report with the state, recommending that the small tunnel be sealed and that the circular chamber with the shaft be left unexplored. She cited safety concerns, unstable rock, and the lack of any practical reason to investigate further. The state accepted her recommendations. 2 weeks later, a crew came out to seal the mine entrances. They used concrete and steel bars, making it impossible for anyone to enter. I was there to supervise, and I watched as they worked. Before they sealed the small tunnel that led to the circular chamber, I took one last look inside. I could see the scratches on the walls, and I could feel the cold air flowing from the shaft, rising up from whatever depth it reached. And I heard something, very faint, almost below the threshold of hearing, a sound like wind, but with a pattern to it, like something breathing, like something whistling a tune that had no melody. The crew sealed it, and I haven't been back. But I think about that shaft sometimes, about how deep it went, deeper than any mine, deeper than any cave we'd mapped in that area, about the bones around its edge and the scratch marks on the walls, about Dr. Chen's words, places where the mountains have their own passages. West Virginia's old. The mountains here are among the oldest in the world, worn down by time but still hiding their secrets. We dig into them looking for coal and minerals, but sometimes we find other things. Things that were there first. Things that might still be there, in the deep places, waiting. The whistlers, the locals call them. Shafts that sing when the wind blows through them. Except sometimes, on quiet days when there's no wind at all, you can still hear them singing.
Our final account tonight comes from a mail carrier who discovered that some rural routes in West Virginia include stops at addresses that shouldn't exist anymore.
My name is Diane, and I'm from Morgantown, West Virginia. I'm 58 years old, and I've worked for the United States Postal Service for 32 years. For most of that time, I've delivered mail on rural routes, the kind where mailboxes are a mile apart and most of your day is spent driving narrow roads through the mountains. It's good work, quiet, independent, and I like the people I deliver to, most of them anyway. This happened about 5 years ago, in 2019. I'd been assigned a new route that covered part of Marion County, specifically a stretch of mountain communities north of Fairmont. The previous carrier, a man named Gerald, had retired after 25 years on that route. He'd trained me for 2 weeks before his last day, driving me around and introducing me to the regular customers. Gerald was an odd guy, quiet, methodical, and he had specific rules for the route that he insisted I follow. Don't deliver after 4 p.m. Don't stop at a house if the porch light is on during the day. Don't go to the address on Kettle Road if you see crows gathering on the power lines. He had a dozen little rules like that, and when I asked him why, he just said, "Trust me, you'll understand." After he retired, I spent the first few weeks learning the route my own way. Some of Gerald's rules made sense. Certain dogs were aggressive. Certain roads were impassable when it rained. Certain customers were drunk and unpleasant in the evenings. But other rules seemed like superstition. The thing about the crows made no sense to me. Crows were everywhere in the mountains. The route had about 150 stops, over 60 miles of mountain roads. Most of it was straightforward. But there was one section that always bothered me, a stretch of road called Kettle Road that ran along a ridge for about 5 miles before dead-ending at an old forest gate. There were only 4 houses on that entire stretch, and 3 of them were abandoned. The one occupied house belonged to an old woman named Mrs. Havens. She was in her 80s, lived alone, and got a lot of mail, catalogs mostly, and pension checks. Gerald had always delivered to her last, at the very end of the route, right before turning around at the forest gate. The first few times I delivered to Mrs. Havens, everything was normal. She'd wave from her window, and I'd put her mail in the box. But after about a month, I started noticing something odd. Sometimes when I'd drive down Kettle Road, there would be a mailbox that I hadn't seen before. It would appear at one of the abandoned houses, a new-looking mailbox mounted on a post, with a name painted on the side. The first time I saw it, the mailbox was at the second house, a falling-down farmhouse with a collapsed barn. The mailbox said Ridley in neat black letters. I stopped and checked my route list. There was no Ridley on my route, and there never had been. The house was clearly abandoned, windows broken, porch caved in. But the mailbox was new. The post was solid, and when I opened it, there was nothing inside. I drove on to Mrs. Havens's house and delivered her mail. When I drove back down Kettle Road 20 minutes later, the Ridley mailbox was gone. Just gone. There was no post, no hole in the ground where a post would have been, nothing. I convinced myself I'd been mistaken about the location, that maybe I'd seen a mailbox at a different house and gotten confused. But it happened again 2 weeks later. This time, the mailbox appeared at the third abandoned house, the one closest to the forest gate. The name on it was Callaway. Again, the house was clearly abandoned. Again, the mailbox was new. Again, when I came back down the road after delivering to Mrs. Havens, the mailbox was gone. This happened 5 more times over the next 2 months. Each time, a different name on the mailbox. Each time, at one of the abandoned houses. Each time, the mailbox would be gone when I drove back. Finally, I asked Mrs. Havens about it. I knocked on her door instead of just leaving mail, and when she answered, I said, "Mrs. Havens, do you know anything about the other houses on this road, the abandoned ones?" She looked at me with sharp, clear eyes. "Which houses?" "The 3 between here and the main road. Do you know who used to live there?" She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Those houses have been empty for 40 years, since the families left." "Where did they go?" "They didn't go anywhere," she said softly. "They just stopped being here." It was in 1979, over one winter. 3 families, 17 people total. They were here in November, and by January they were gone. Houses were empty, cars were still in the driveways, but no people. Sheriff investigated, but he never found them. After a few years, people stopped asking questions. "What do you think happened to them?" I asked. Mrs. Havens looked past me, down the road toward the forest gate. "I think the road took them. Kettle Road. It's been here longer than any of us, longer than the houses, longer than the town. The old people used to say the road goes places it shouldn't, that sometimes it opens up and takes things. Used to be animals, mostly. Deer would wander onto the road and disappear. Then it started taking people. First 1 or 2 over the years, then all 3 families at once." She looked back at me. "I've lived here for 60 years. I've seen things on this road that I can't explain. My advice? Deliver my mail, then turn around and go home. Don't stop at the other houses. Don't investigate. The road doesn't like attention." I should have listened to her. But I'm stubborn, and I wanted to understand what I was seeing. So the next time a mailbox appeared, I didn't just drive past. I stopped. It was at the first abandoned house, closest to the main road. The mailbox said, "Porter," and this time there was mail in it. A single envelope addressed to Mr. James Porter, Kettle Road. There was no return address, and the envelope had no postage. It looked old, the paper slightly yellowed. I took the envelope. I'm not supposed to. Mail that hasn't gone through proper channels isn't my responsibility, but I wanted to see what was inside. I opened it. The letter inside was handwritten, dated January 12th, 1979. It read, "James, the road is opening tomorrow night. We've seen the signs, the crows are gathering, and the trees are leaning wrong. Elders say we should leave, but where would we go? This has been our home for generations. We'll wait it out like we always have. Make sure the children stay inside. Make sure all the doors are locked. Don't go out no matter what you hear. With hope, Robert." I stood there reading it 3 times. 1979, the year Mrs. Havens said the families disappeared. I looked at the abandoned house. In daylight, it was just an old, falling down structure. But as I looked at it, I realized something was wrong with the perspective. The house seemed farther away than it should be, like it was receding even as I watched. And the trees around it were leaning, all of them, angled slightly toward the house, at angles that didn't match the slope of the ground. I got back in my truck and drove to Mrs. Havens' house. My hands were shaking. I delivered her mail, and she came to the door. "You stopped at one of the houses," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I admitted. "You need to leave, right now. Drive back to town and don't come back until tomorrow. The crows are gathering." I looked back down the road. She was right. Dozens of crows were landing on the power lines, more arriving every moment. The sky was full of them. I drove away fast, faster than I should have on that narrow road. When I reached the main road and looked back, I saw something that shouldn't have been possible. Ketcher Road looked longer than it had been. The abandoned houses were visible, but they seemed miles away instead of a few hundred yards. And at the very end of the road, beyond Mrs. Havens' house, beyond the forest gate, I could see something else. Another road continuing into the mountains, a road that glowed with a pale light in the afternoon sun. I didn't go back to Ketcher Road for 3 days. When I finally did, everything was normal. The abandoned houses were in their usual places. No strange mailboxes, no crows. Mrs. Havens came out to get her mail and said, "Good, you listened. Smart girl." But it happened again and again. About once a month, usually around the new moon, a mailbox would appear at one of the abandoned houses, always with a different name, always with mail inside. Letters from 1979, addressed to people who disappeared. I stopped opening them. I'd just drive past, note that the mailbox was there, and deliver to Mrs. Havens. And every time when I drove back, the mailbox would be gone. Gerald's rule made sense now. Don't go to Ketcher Road if the crows are gathering. The crows were the warning sign. When they gathered, the road was doing whatever it was it did, opening up to wherever it connected. And the mailboxes were part of it, echoes of the people who'd been taken, mail that had never been delivered because the addresses had disappeared. Last year, Mrs. Havens died. Natural causes. She was 90 years old. Her house sat empty for a few months, and then a young couple bought it, city people looking for a quiet place to live. I warned them about the road, tried to explain in a way that wouldn't sound crazy, but they just smiled and thanked me for the local color. They moved in October. I delivered their mail for 3 weeks. Then one day in early November, I drove down Ketcher Road and saw crows gathering. Hundreds of them, covering the power lines, and there were 4 mailboxes where there had been 3. The new one said Morrison, which was the last name of the young couple. I drove to their house. It looked abandoned. Windows dark, no cars in the driveway, porch empty. I knocked on the door. No answer. I tried the handle. Locked. I walked around to look in the windows. The furniture was still there. Personal belongings were still there, but there were no people. I called the sheriff. They investigated, filed a missing persons report, checked with the couple's families. Nobody knew where they'd gone. Their cars were eventually found at the house, keys inside. Their bank accounts were never accessed again. They simply vanished. Now there are 4 abandoned houses on Ketcher Road, and once a month, when the crows gather, I see 4 mailboxes: Ridley, Callaway, Porter, and Morrison. Sometimes there's mail in them. Letters that were never delivered to people who disappeared. I don't stop anymore. I don't even slow down. I just drive to the forest gate, turn around, and drive back. If Mrs. Havens's mail piles up at the post office because there's no one to deliver to anymore, that's not my problem. I've thought about asking to be reassigned to a different route, but I'm 3 years from retirement, and I know Kettle Road now. I know its rules. I know when to stay away. Better me than some new carrier who doesn't understand, who might stop at one of those mailboxes and open a letter and step out their truck at the wrong moment when the road is open and reaching. Sometimes I think about the families who were taken in 1979, about whether they're still somewhere on the road that glows with that pale light, walking forever on a route that never ends. And I think about the young couple who bought Mrs. Havens' house, who didn't listen to warnings, who are now names on a mailbox that appears and disappears like clockwork. The mountains are old, and the roads through them are older. Some of them go places we're not meant to follow, but the mail still needs to be delivered, and carriers like me still drive those roads every day, careful to follow the rules that keep us safe. Don't stop at houses with porch lights on during the day. Don't deliver after 4 p.m. And don't go to Kettle Road when the crows are gathering, because the road is patient. It's been taking people for longer than anyone remembers, and it's always hungry for more.
These are the stories we've collected from the mountains of West Virginia, accounts from people who went there for work, for family, for reasons both ordinary and unexpected, and who found something waiting in those ancient hills. The Appalachian Mountains are among the oldest on Earth, worn down by time into rounded peaks and deep hollows where the sunlight barely reaches. The communities scattered through these mountains have their own histories, their own secrets, and their own ways of surviving in a landscape that was never entirely tamed. What these stories share is a sense of something old and patient, something that was there before the towns and the mines and the roads, something that claims these mountains as its own, whether it's lights rising from forgotten valleys, doors that shouldn't be opened, towns that loop back on themselves, or roads that reach into places beyond our maps. The message is clear. These mountains have rules. The people who live there learn those rules and follow them. The ones who don't, the ones who push too far or ignore the warnings, they become stories themselves. Cautionary tales shared in diners and ranger stations, whispered on front porches as the sun goes down. If you ever find yourself driving through West Virginia, through those winding mountain roads where the trees close in overhead and the towns are so small they barely have names, pay attention. Listen to the locals. If they tell you not to go somewhere, don't go. If they warn you about lights in a particular valley or sounds from an old mine, believe them. These mountains have been keeping their secrets for millions of years, and they're not interested in giving them up. The price for curiosity is higher than you want to pay. Thank you for listening to Blacktop Files. If you have your own story from these mountains or from anywhere else where the familiar world seems to thin and something else shows through, you can send it to us through the link in the description. Until next time, stay safe out there, and remember that some roads are better left untraveled.